Okay, so we're doing Surah 92 tonight, and fittingly, it's called the Night or Al La'il. And the focus of this, or one of the focuses, is taqwa or God consciousness, and it's also known as just avoiding things that you dislike. And this is an important principle in Islam. And there are different interpretations of this surah. The Shia look at this as kind of a guidepost for the imamate, which is the supposedly unbroken chain of imams dating back to Muhammad. Hi, Inky. Which would include the Rashidun Caliphate. So they look at this as guidance for imams. Hi, GW. And it begins with Allah swearing again. He does that a lot. I swear by the night when it draws a veil, and the day when it shines in brightness, and the creating of the male and the female. Your striving is most surely directed to various ends. Then, as for him who gives away and guards against evil and accepts the best. So, striving is very important in Islam. And the interesting here in verse 6, it says, and accepts the best. And this is one of those superlatives that's never really defined within Islam. It Muhammad is giving people advice through the guise of Allah to do what's the best, but he's not saying what the best is other than what conforms to Islam. And the fact that Islam is just another form of situational ethics. There's no real objective standard that you can set by. Things are constantly changing. That's why you have surahs that are abrogated. You have things that are changed even within the Quran itself. So you can't use Islam or what Allah does as a standard by which to um, as an ethical standard. So he just says the best accepts the best, and it's not really defined. It's only defined insofar as the best is what conforms to Islam. And this kind of reminds me of the challenge of the Quran or the tahadi. And this is the this is the kind of circular argument that says if the Quran isn't from God, then you would be able to replicate a verse from it. And there are a number of problems with this. The first one being that it's not really testable because there's no specification as to what the barometer of judgment is. What are you testing it against? I mean, how will you judge? What are the criteria for judging whether or not whether or not a verse you create is better than the Quran? Also, there are people that have done this. I mentioned this in a few other videos, but there were two Coptic Christians that created something called the True Furqan, which is stylistically copied from the Quran. It mimics everything in terms of the aesthetics of the Quran, the way the phraseology. The only difference is that instead of the confused soteriology and eschatology found in the Quran, you have verses that end by praising God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But that's the only substantive difference. It's basically a carbon copy of the Quran. So they met the challenge, and yet Muslims still point to this ridiculous, ridiculous thing that supposedly demonstrates that the Quran is can't be replicated, that it has to have come from God. But again, there's no it's not really something that can be falsified. It's something that's there that that Muslims invoke as a way of diffusing any sort of criticism. So when you say and accepts the best, but you never define what the best is, you, you're really you're really standing on shaky ground. So in verse 7 it says, "We will facilitate for him the easy end, And as for him who is parsimonious and considers himself free from need of Allah and rejects the best, again, best is not defined, we will facilitate for him the difficult end, and his wealth will not avail him when he perishes. And this is similar to verse 18, which says, who gives away his wealth, purifying himself. And this was of immense importance to Muhammad, bankrolling his various jihads. And he participated directly, I think, in over 8 battles. And there were more expeditions. I mentioned the expedition to Tabuk, which wasn't even a battle. It was just him simply, supposedly, according to Islamic tradition, going to the border and looking at the Byzantine forces as as a um, as something that's symbolic of Muslim strength and challenging the Romans, i.e., the Byzantine Empire at the time. So he participated in a lot of these battles. Sometimes he wasn't like Napoleon. He wasn't leading his troops very often. So the bravery attributed to Muhammad is very it's dubious. If you actually study the history of Muhammad's participation in battles, there were Muslim soldiers that were a lot more courageous in terms of fightings, getting out in front than he was. He was definitely not a Napoleon or Alexander or Julius Caesar in terms of that military mettle. But there are a lot of these, and but he needed funding for this, so he was always imploring and demanding that Muslims give him money, particularly wealthy patrons, so that he could have benefactors that would support him as he went out and attacked and sacked caravans and looted other Arab tribes. So in verse 12, it says, surely ours is it to show the way, and most surely ours is the hereafter and the former. Keep in mind, this is referring to Allah. So he's referring to Allah with a plural pronoun, even though Muslims reject the concept of the Trinity. And they can't really explain this when you bring this up with them. They say it's a royal we, which is not accurate, but that's their justification for the fact that Allah is repeatedly referred to with plural pronouns, our, ours, we. Even in this surah, this very short surah, he's referred to. He uses that pronoun, I think, at least 4 times, or pronouns like that 4 times. And most surely ours is the hereafter and the former. Therefore, I warn you of the fire that flames. It's kind of redundant, but there you have it. None shall enter it but the most unhappy. Again, this is simply a lie. Even in the Quran itself, it says that Muslims will enter hell, or they will taste of the fire. Now, Muslims will say there's a distinction there, but there isn't. Again, it's just them trying to get around these problematic verses. So in 16, it says, who gives the lie to the truth and turns his back? Ironically, this was written by someone who was a congenital liar. In 17, it says, and away from it shall be kept the one who guards against evil. And even going back to 15, which says none shall enter it but the most unhappy, this also contradicts the Quranic principle that most people, particularly women, most women are going to hell. If you read the surah, it makes it seem like there's a very intransigent minority that's going to be condemned to hell, when throughout the rest of the Quran you would be led to believe that it's the complete opposite. So 18, again, who gives away his wealth, purifying himself. This was a way for Muhammad to dun other Muslims who were leery of actually going into battle. They would just suppent, and this is a huge part of jihad today. The fact is, even though there's an enormous number of jihadists who actively plot violence and go out and participate in suicide bombings, it's still, or knife attacks or van attacks, it's still a small percentage of the Muslim population, but there's a much larger percentage that will contribute in some way through zakah or funding. And you see this even with quote unquote mainstream groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations. They were an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. All sorts of Muslim Brotherhood offshoots in North America, like the Islamic Circle of North America. And these are all tied in some way to jihad, albeit not directly, even though there are members of CARE who were indicted and prosecuted for participating in violent jihad. It's much more likely that they would participate through financial jihad in some way. So in 19 it says, and no one has with him any boon for which he should be rewarded, except the seeking of the pleasure of his Lord the Most High. Keep in mind, there's an entire chapter of the Quran devoted to war booty, and it's called the spoils of war, and a fifth of them are reserved for Muhammad himself. So again, this is one of the parts of the Quran that's inherently contradictory. So in 21 it says, and he shall soon be well pleased. So that's Surah 92. That's one of the few remaining surahs that's a little bit longer. There's one more that's 19 verses, but after that it's just 8, 10, 11, and it goes on until it's just a single paragraph. But we're almost done. We're about 10 pages, I think. Yeah, 10 pages from completing the Quran read through. Like I said, be sure to share these videos since we're nearing the home stretch. It would be great if there would be more people watching these, particularly Muslims. I don't even mind the Muslim trolls so much, but I always look for constructive criticism. Anyway, that's the video, and we will see you next time.